I think it's really important that we can try and change and tackle the narrative around homelessness. People live with it. We see it every day in our lives. That's something I want to challenge.
They say a crown never truly rests. But what happens when the man wearing it can no longer stand beneath its weight? This is the day Britain held its breath, and a son stepped into history. Before we begin, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Because what you're about to hear isn't just royal history, it's the moment the monarchy changed forever. Sometimes, life changes in the blink of an eye, even for those born with crowns. Just moments ago, Prince William faced the cameras outside Windsor Castle, his face pale, his hands trembling, his voice barely steady. And then came the words no son ever wishes to say. My father, the king, is in critical condition. The wind seemed to stop. The reporters froze. For a heartbeat, all of Britain stood still, as if the very air had been stolen from the kingdom. This wasn't just another royal announcement. This was the sound of a nation holding its breath. It was supposed to be an ordinary autumn evening at Windsor. But suddenly, every screen in Britain flickered, breaking news banners flashing red. Prince William to address the nation. No one expected him. Not tonight, not alone. He stepped forward beneath the cold lamps of the courtyard, where rain shimmered on the stones like glass. The crowd outside was silent, a sea of umbrellas and worried faces. Reporters lowered their microphones, sensing the gravity before he even spoke. Good evening, he began quietly. I ask for your prayers and your patience. 6 words, that's all it took. 6 words to send shockwaves across the world. For the first time in modern history, the king was no longer the voice of the crown. He was the subject of its prayers. Inside the palace, the royal flag began to lower halfway down the mast. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The crown wasn't lost, but it was trembling. From the corridors of Buckingham to the streets of Birmingham, people whispered, "What happened to the king?" Within minutes, the BBC interrupted programming. News anchors spoke with hushed tones. Analysts avoided eye contact, and across social media, one line began to spread like wildfire. The king's voice has fallen silent, and his silence now echoes across the world. While the nation watched in shock, inside Windsor Castle, chaos and heartbreak intertwined. Queen Camilla refused to leave the king's bedside. Her hands, once calm and composed, now trembled as she held onto his. The quiet hum of medical machines filled the room that had once echoed with laughter and royal conversation. Doctors and aides moved quickly, but their faces revealed what their words would not. Princess Anne, ever the pillar of strength, had taken command. She coordinated staff, cancelled appearances, and quietly made arrangements, ensuring the royal machinery kept moving even as the family inside fell apart. Meanwhile, Prince William divided himself between 2 worlds, the son grieving behind closed doors, and the future king standing firm before the cameras. Outside the gates, thousands gathered. The candlelight from their vigils flickered through the mist, painting the stone walls in a trembling gold. Children left handwritten notes. Veterans saluted in silence. News channels across the Atlantic began broadcasting live. CNN anchors spoke of a crisis within the crown. Sky News called it the darkest hour of the modern monarchy. And as the crowd grew larger, one question began to echo louder than the rest. If the king falls, who will steady the crown? Behind those ancient walls, even the most loyal staff whispered it. This isn't just an illness. It's a royal reckoning. To understand how they got here, we must go back, months before that chilling night. In the summer, those closest to the king began noticing subtle changes. The once tireless monarch, who could endure hours of ceremonies without rest, began showing signs of fatigue. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly during official signatures. During one engagement, a photographer captured a fleeting moment, the king reaching for a chair for balance. It was dismissed as exhaustion, but for those who knew him, it was more than that. Camilla noticed first. The long hours were wearing him down, but every time she urged him to rest, he smiled and said, "My mother didn't slow down. Neither will I." It was more than pride. It was duty, the weight of a legacy. Behind the palace walls, whispers grew louder. Aides reported sleepless nights, fainting spells, and missed appointments. But the palace maintained its iron mask, releasing statements that spoke only of light fatigue and a busy schedule. Behind the curtains, though, royal physicians held emergency consultations. They knew the truth. The king's condition was delicate, worsening quietly, shielded by centuries of silence. Yet through it all, Charles insisted on continuing his public duties. He smiled for cameras, waved to crowds, and spoke about climate change and unity, all while fighting his body's quiet rebellion. And so, the world saw a strong king. But inside, the cracks had begun to show. For months, the crown looked unshaken, but behind the smiles, the truth was trembling. Then came the night that changed everything. An emergency meeting was called at Windsor Castle. Present were Anne, Edward, Sophie, Camilla, and William. The atmosphere was heavy, a mix of fear, formality, and quiet love. The long table was scattered with folders, reports, and the weight of decisions no one wanted to make. The royal physician spoke first, his voice calm but grave. His Majesty's condition may deteriorate quickly. We must prepare for all outcomes. Camilla broke her silence. All outcomes? She whispered, her eyes glistening. Anne, steady as ever, replied softly, We have to face reality, Camilla. For his sake, and for the country. William sat still, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He wasn't just a son in that moment. He was a man staring at the crown that would one day rest on his own head. And then came the decision that changed the course of history. If the king's health declined further, it would be William, not the Prime Minister, not the courtiers, who would speak to the nation. The message was clear. Leadership would quietly transition from father to son, from one heartbeat to another. Royal aides introduced a phrase few had ever heard before. Operation Regent Crown. It was a plan drawn up decades earlier, a roadmap for a monarchy in crisis. Behind closed doors, preparations began. Doctors remained on standby. Security was tightened. Communications were coded. And yet, through it all, one thing was clear. This was no longer about succession. It was about survival. The survival of a man, a family, and an institution built on the idea that the crown never falters. But now, even the crown seemed to tremble. October 16th. It began like any other evening. The king had been resting after a long day of meetings. Camilla had insisted on staying by his side, reading aloud from one of his favorite poetry books. The rain outside tapped against the windows like a slow drumbeat, until suddenly, that rhythm was broken by the sound of shouting in the corridor. Aides rushed in. The medical alarm was triggered. Camilla dropped the book, her voice trembling as she called for help. Doctors flooded the room within seconds, their faces masks of urgency. Across the hall, staff scrambled. Guards sealed entrances. The castle, usually so serene, erupted into chaos. And in that moment, somewhere between panic and prayer, William's phone rang. Your Majesty, it's your father. The words froze him in place. He drove through the storm toward Windsor. The roads eerily empty, the wipers struggling against sheets of rain. By the time he arrived, the air was thick with silence. Aides stood still. Camilla's eyes were red, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. William stepped inside his father's room. The monitors beeped steadily. The air smelled of antiseptic and despair. He reached for his father's hand, warm but weak. For a long moment, he said nothing. And then quietly, I'm here, Dad. Outside, the world didn't yet know. But inside Windsor, everyone did. Doctors made their announcement to the family first. The king's condition is critical. 5 words that changed everything. Camilla gasped, covering her mouth. Anne bowed her head. William stood frozen, grief and duty colliding in one devastating heartbeat. Within minutes, news broke across the globe. Television screens from London to Los Angeles flashed the same headline. Breaking. King Charles in critical condition. Reporters fought to stay composed. Crowds outside the palace began to sing, God Save the King. Their voices breaking, tears falling in the rain. Inside, William looked once more at his father and whispered, Rest now. I'll take it from here. The monarchy had reached its most fragile moment. One reign trembling, another silently awakening, and as the night deepened, a new chapter of royal history began to write itself. Not in ink, but in silence. But the truth runs deeper than illness, because what happened next, inside Windsor's shadowed halls, would quietly begin rewriting the future of the British. Crown, the king's body may have weakened, but his legacy was about to spark something far greater, a transformation that no one in Britain could have foreseen. By sunrise, Windsor had changed. The courtyard that once shimmered with ceremony now lay drenched in silence. The flags hung low, unmoving in the heavy dawn. A hush clung to the air, as if even the wind refused to disturb what remained sacred. The man who spoke for Britain could no longer speak for himself. And what unfolded next wasn't just history. It was humanity laid bare. Inside the palace, time lost its rhythm. The corridors that usually hummed with footsteps and clipped orders now echoed only with whispers. Doctors moved through the private wing in soft shoes. Their radios turned low. Aides stood guard outside the king's chamber, eyes red from sleepless nights. Camilla refused to leave his side. Every hour she adjusted the thin blanket around him. Every few minutes she checked the ring on his finger, the same ring he had worn since their wedding day. When he stirred, she whispered his name as though calling him back from some distant shore. Anne handled what Camilla could not. Her strength was quiet but relentless. She signed documents, approved schedules, reassured ministers, and still found a moment each dawn to sit beside her brother and rest a hand on his shoulder. William didn't sleep. He paced the private library, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had faced their own storms. Each face seemed to watch him, reminding him that duty had never been optional in this family. The household staff tried to maintain normalcy. Breakfast trays were delivered on time, flowers replaced daily, candles lit at dusk. Yet everyone felt the weight of waiting. The space between heartbeats, between news updates, between hope and resignation. Every great dynasty fears one thing: the silence between breaths. For the Windsors, that silence had begun. Outside the palace gates, the world had already begun to respond. The BBC replaced its usual broadcast with a black and white banner: Royal Family Requests Privacy. CNN anchors spoke in hushed tones, avoiding speculation, but unable to hide the tension in their voices. Sky News reporters stood in the drizzle, their microphones shaking slightly, as they described a moment of deep uncertainty for the United Kingdom. Church bells tolled across London. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham, lighting candles and holding up photographs of the king in his youth. The glow of phones recorded everything, a nation documenting its own worry. On social media, two hashtags began to dominate: Yirgwo God Save the King and Yirno Long Live William. They trended side by side, the past and the future sharing a single feed. In California, Prince Harry released a brief statement through his spokesperson. "My family is in my thoughts. I ask that the public gives them space." It was diplomatic, measured, and yet it reignited the debate that never truly sleeps. Unity versus distance. Duty versus independence. Pundits speculated about the Regency Act, the possibility of William stepping in temporarily. Economists spoke of market jitters. Historians compared this moment to the twilight of Elizabeth II's reign. But beyond the politics and the headlines, ordinary people prayed. In pubs, in churches, on buses. Strangers who had never met the king found themselves whispering small words of comfort into the air. In every headline, one unspoken truth lingered. The new era wasn't waiting. It had already begun. Inside the palace, tension was a quiet undercurrent beneath the grief. Camilla clung to hope with fierce loyalty. "He's not gone yet," she said every time someone mentioned succession. Her faith in him was unshakable, not because she denied reality, but because she had lived her whole life loving the man behind the crown. Anne, pragmatic as always, knew decisions couldn't wait. She pressed for clarity about public appearances, about the transition of duties. "The country needs certainty," she told William. William listened but said little. His eyes were shadowed by exhaustion, yet his posture remained unbroken. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried both gentleness and command. "Father would want continuity," he said simply. We honor him by carrying on. Catherine's presence steadied everything. In public, she was serene, a calm face framed by the soft blue of her coat as she greeted crowds and accepted flowers. Behind closed doors, she was William's anchor. Late at night, she found him staring out of the window, and she'd place a hand on his back until his breathing slowed. They spoke little about the future. It was too heavy a subject, but in their silence was understanding. They were standing at the edge of history, and the world was already watching. The monarchy was holding its breath. And Catherine's grace reminded the world how to breathe again. 3 days into the crisis, the palace announced that the Prince of Wales would address the nation. At precisely 6 p.m., cameras focused on a single figure emerging from the grand entrance of Windsor Castle. William's suit was black, his tie the shade of midnight. Rain dotted his shoulders as he began to speak. My father has devoted his life to service, to faith, to family, and to this country. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for his recovery and your faith in our shared strength as a nation. No flourish, no dramatics, just sincerity. And yet, the impact was seismic. Across living rooms, televisions flickered with his image. Elderly couples in small villages wept quietly. Children asked their parents why the prince looked so sad. Analysts remarked on his composure. Commentators called it a speech worthy of a king. Inside, Camilla watched from a private screen. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "He's speaking like his father." Within an hour, global networks replayed the address. Headlines read, "A prince steps forward. William carries the crown's weight with grace." And on social media, the phrase, "Long live William," surged once more. Without ceremony or crown, Britain had found its new leader, and he carried his father's voice within his own. As the days blurred into nights, the king drifted between moments of clarity and quiet stillness. The medical team called it a fragile stability. One evening, Anne entered his room and found him awake, his eyes faintly open. She took his hand and smiled, the same sisterly smile that had comforted him since childhood. "Steady the ship," he whispered. 2 simple words, faint but deliberate. Anne froze. Those were the exact words their mother had spoken before she passed. The phrase had become almost sacred, a secret benediction passed down through generations. Later that night, she told William. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. In that moment, he understood. Legacy isn't inherited, it's entrusted. His father had given him both a command and a blessing. Outside, Windsor's lamps glowed against the mist. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone violinist played "God Save the King." The notes drifted through. The night like a farewell, a crown begins in shadow, and this one was rising in silence. When the palace finally confirmed the king's passing, the statement was brief and reverent. His Majesty the King passed peacefully this evening, surrounded by family. The words rippled through the world like a slow tide. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Across Britain, church bells rang again, not in warning, but in mourning. In London, thousands gathered at Buckingham's gates, their candles painting the night gold. In Edinburgh, the sound of bagpipes echoed through the streets. In Toronto, Sydney, and Nairobi, monuments were lit in soft royal purple. Catherine appeared briefly on the balcony, her eyes glistening but calm. She placed a single white rose on the railing, a gesture that traveled the globe in minutes. Camilla, veiled in black, emerged beside William for a brief walkabout. The public that once doubted her now reached out with kindness. "We're praying for you," one woman whispered as Camilla touched her hand through the barrier. Anne stood behind them, her posture straight, her expression composed, the embodiment of service. In that moment, the monarchy no longer felt distant. It felt human. There were no crowns, no jewels, only people united by loss and love. William's speech at St. George's Chapel that week captured it perfectly. "My father's reign was brief but bright. His legacy will not be measured in years, but in hearts touched." For the first time, Britain didn't see royals. It saw a family, fragile, faithful, and real. The night after the funeral, Windsor was quiet once more. The crowds had dispersed, the candles had burned down to wax puddles, and the city lights shimmered faintly in the distance. William stood alone on the balcony, Below him, a small group of mourners still lingered, their candles flickering like stars caught in the wind. He looked up at the sky, where the moon rested behind slow-moving clouds, and whispered, "You built the bridge, Father. I'll walk it." In that sentence lived the weight of generations, kings and queens who had ruled through wars, pandemics and revolutions, all leaving something behind for those who followed. He thought of his grandmother's steady hand, waving to the crowd, his father's warm laughter during state visits, his mother's compassion that reshaped how the world saw the crown. All those moments had carved the path that now stretched before him. He turned back toward the hall, where Catherine waited quietly. Their eyes met, tired, tear-streaked, but strong. She nodded once, silently telling him that the world was ready, that duty was calling again. Tomorrow, he would meet the Prime Minister. Tomorrow, he would attend briefings and prepare a coronation the world hadn't expected so soon. But tonight, he allowed himself to be simply a son. He looked out once more over the quiet grounds and spoke the final words meant for no camera, no headline, only the wind. "Thank you for showing me what it means to serve." The wind carried the whisper across the courtyard, rustling the Union flag, still at half-mast. For a moment, it seemed to lift slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. And then, as dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight touched the palace stones, turning them from grey to gold. A new morning, a new reign, born not out of ambition, but of love. Because in the end, the story of the crown has never been about power. It's about endurance, about hearts that keep beating even when the world holds its breath. If this moment touched your heart, like and share to honor the king's legacy. Tell us in the comments, how do you remember Charles? As a ruler, a father, or simply a man who tried his best? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because this story isn't over. The next chapter of the British monarchy begins now.